The summer Ellie Calloway turned 9 years old, her grandfather woke her before dawn. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway of her room until she opened her eyes the way animals know when they're being watched. He was dressed already. Canvas jacket, boots, laced his white hair, combed back with water. He said one word, "Come." They walked out through the kitchen, where the coffee pot was still cold across the porch, where the boards creaked in the same three places they always creaked, and down the slope toward the lower pasture. The sky was the color it gets before the sun commits to rising, that strange blue that doesn't exist at any other hour. Her grandfather called it the blue hour. He said it was the only time the land told the truth without being asked. The grass was wet. Ellie's boots were too big, hand-me-downs from a cousin in Billings, and they slapped against her calves as she walked. Henry Calloway moved slowly but without hesitation, the way a man moves through his own house in the dark. He had been walking this land for 53 years. They reached the lower pasture where the ground flattened out toward the river bottom, and he stopped. He pointed at the grass. Ellie looked. At first she didn't see anything, then she did. A stripe of darker green running through the field, curving gently, maybe 3 feet wide, the color just different enough to notice if someone told you to look. The grass along that stripe grew taller and leaned slightly east, as if reaching for something underground. "There's a river under there," Henry said. "It doesn't flow anymore, but it hasn't died. The land remembers where the water used to go." He walked her along the curve. It took nearly an hour, winding through the bottom in a lazy shape like a letter drawn by a tired hand. At one point, where the curve bent sharpest, he stopped and pulled a wooden stake from his jacket pocket. Short, maybe 18 inches, sharpened at one end. He pushed it into the ground with both hands, leaning on it until it sank a foot deep. The soil gave way easily, too easily. "This is the weakest spot," he said. "Remember it." That was 5 years ago. Ellie was 14 now, and the stake was still there. She checked it every spring. It leaned a little more each year, tilting south, the way the barn tilted south, settling into its angle, like everything else on the Calloway place that had been standing long enough to find its own truth. The farm sat on the eastern bend of the Cottonwood River in a stretch of Montana that most people drove through without stopping. 300 acres of hayfield pasture and timber that had been growing there before anyone showed up with a deed and a fence. The house was built in 1911 by Ellie's great-grandfather, a man she knew only from a photograph in the hallway where he stood next to a horse, and neither of them were smiling. The barn leaned south. Her father said it had been leaning that way since before he was born. Some things find their angle and stay there. Henry Calloway had his stroke 2 summers back. It took his speech, most of it. He could manage a few words at a time, sometimes a short sentence if the words were simple, and he had rested. Mostly he sat in his wheelchair by the window in the room that used to be the sewing room, looking out at the land he had walked every day for more than half a century. His wife June, 74 years old with a straight back and silver hair, she still pinned up every morning, took care of him. She was not a woman who wasted words either. When she spoke, the room listened, not because she raised her voice, but because she never spoke unless she meant it. Ellie's father, Tom, was 46 and looked older. He had been running the place alone since Henry went down and the farm was running him. $800 in vet bills sat on the kitchen table next to a salt shaker and a coffee mug with a crack down the side. The tractor needed a new gearbox, and Tom was getting by with a steel lever he'd welded himself to force the shifter into third. The loan on the farm was 60 days past due. Ellie knew this because she heard him on the phone at 4 in the morning, his voice low and tight in the dark kitchen, saying the words that men say when they are asking for time they don't believe they'll get. "I need another 90 days. He didn't complain. He got up before the sun and went to the barn and came back after dark and sat at the table and looked at the bills and then went to bed. Ellie watched him the way she watched everything quietly from a distance, close enough to see, but far enough not to interfere. She kept a green spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer. Every day she wrote in it the date, the water level at the ford measured against the high water mark on the old cottonwood tree, where the deer were drinking, which gates the cattle refused to walk through, and which ones they crowded toward in the afternoon, where the killdeer were nesting, how the cattails looked in the south slough, whether the wet patch at the base of the lower pasture, the one that had been wet every May since she could remember, was wet or dry, and how far down you had to push a stick before you hit something cold. Henry had kept the same kind of notebook for 53 years, starting in 1971. They were stacked in a wooden crate in the barn loft, all of them in his small, neat handwriting, blue ink on lined paper. 53 notebooks. Ellie had read every one. She wasn't a strange child. She just listened more than she talked. And the land, if you listened, had a lot to say. That spring, the river ran lower than it should have. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing that made the news, just 3 or 4 inches below the high water mark on the cottonwood at the ford. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Ellie noticed. She noticed the killdeer were nesting 20 yards farther from the bank than they had the previous spring. She noticed the cattails in the south slough had thinned out their stalks shorter and paler than usual. And she noticed that the wet patch at the base of the lower pasture was dry on top for the first time in her memory. But when she pushed a stick through the surface, she felt nothing for the first 6 inches, and then the stick met something cold and yielding below. Wet ground hidden under a dry crust. The water had dropped, but it hadn't left. She wrote it all down. One evening in late March, she sat beside Henry's wheelchair with her notebook open, reading him her entry for the day. She did this most evenings. He couldn't respond with words, but he responded. When she read him the detail about the killdeer nesting farther from the bank, his hand resting on the arm of the wheelchair tightened around hers. A small squeeze. That was how he said yes. That was how he said you're right. That was how he said keep watching. June stood in the doorway of the room, a dish towel over her shoulder, and watched the two of them. The old man in the wheelchair and the girl with the notebook. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, turned, and went back to the kitchen without a word. The trucks came in late April. 3 white pickups with a logo on the door, a stylized shield with the words Pacific Ridge Bank Commercial Real Estate Division. Behind the trucks came a flatbed carrying a yellow surveyor's rig, and behind that a black SUV with tinted windows that looked like it had never been on a gravel road before and didn't plan to make a habit of it. They stopped at the fence line where the Callaway property ended and the old Whitaker place began. 5,000 acres. The Whitakers had sold the previous fall after the last brother died, and the heirs in Portland and Phoenix and somewhere in Florida decided that none of them wanted to come back to Montana to run cattle on land that barely paid for itself. Pacific Ridge Bank had bought the parcel outright through its commercial real estate division. The feed store in town said it was a long-term hold with plans to develop a logistics hub, agricultural processing, the kind of thing that sounds like progress when you say it fast. The land had been quiet all winter. Now it wasn't quiet anymore. Ellie and Tom were at the feed store the week the trucks arrived. Old man Traeger, who had owned the place for 30 years, was talking about the project to anyone who would listen. Jobs, infrastructure, the town coming back to life. His son Mason, 15, stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, watching Ellie. "Your place is gonna be worth a fortune," Mason said. "Land prices around you are going up. You should be happy." Ellie didn't answer. She looked through the window and saw one of the white trucks pass on the highway. Tom paid for his feed in cash, exact change, and they drove home in silence. After a while, Tom said, "They're going to build right on the river bottom. All 5,000 acres, that's what Traeger says." Bank flew people in from Denver. Ellie looked at her father. "Dad, that's the worst place to build." Tom kept his eyes on the road. "It's not our land, Ellie. The bank can do what it wants." A silence. Then Tom said quieter, "I can't afford to fight on two fronts." He meant the farm loan. He meant the vet bills and the tractor and the 60 days past due and the 4 a.m. phone calls. He meant that picking a fight with a bank that could buy their 300 acres out of petty cash was a luxury he could not afford. Ellie understood. She wrote in her notebook that night, "Dad says it's not our land, but water doesn't know about property lines." The first time she met them was a Tuesday. She was walking the fence line the way she did every week, checking for breaks in the wire, and she saw them on the other side. 5 people standing around a folding table, set up in the grass, a roll of blueprints held down by river stones. The woman saw her first. Maybe 40, blonde hair pulled back, wearing boots that cost more than Tom's monthly feed bill and hadn't been broken in yet. She had a real smile, not the kind people put on like a uniform. "Hey there, you live around here?" Ellie pointed across the fence. "Right there." "Oh, perfect. We're going to be neighbors." The woman walked closer and extended her hand over the fence wire. "I'm Lauren Sheffield. I'm with Pacific Ridge Bank. We're project managing the development." Standing behind Lauren was a large man, maybe 50, with a weathered face and hands that had done real work at some point in his life. Ray Sutter. He didn't smile. He looked at Ellie the way you look at a bird sitting on a fence post. There and not relevant. Another man, older, wearing a fleece vest with the bank's shield logo on the breast, was tapping on a tablet. Grant Whitfield, Vice President, Commercial Real Estate. He looked up, briefly nodded, looked back down. Ellie studied the plans on the table. She couldn't read them upside down, but she could see the layout. A long, rectangular building marked Phase 1 sitting right in the river bottom. Parking and a holding yard above it. 2 more phases stretching up the slope toward the timber. "You're putting the main building down there," she said. Lauren glanced at the plans. "The processing facility, yes. We need the rail spur, and it runs along the bottom." Ellie chose her words carefully. Her grandfather had taught her that you only get one chance to be heard by people who aren't listening, and you shouldn't waste it on the wrong sentence. "The river doesn't stay where you think it does. It moved twice in my grandfather's lifetime. There's an old channel buried under that bottom. You can see it in the spring when the grass comes in different. The ground is soft a long way down and the channel curves. It runs from the upper pasture all the way down toward our spring." Grant Whitfield looked up from his tablet. "We've got a geotechnical survey team coming next week. They'll drill test pits across the entire footprint. Appreciate the heads up, though." He said it kindly. That was the part that hurt. He wasn't dismissing her out of cruelty. He was being polite to a child. "The drill points won't be in the right places," Ellie said. "The channel curves. It doesn't run in a straight line." Sutter cut in. His voice was flat, not mean, just finished. "Kid, I've built on ground worse than this in 7 states. Don't worry about it." Nate Dawson, the geotechnical engineer from Billings who would be running the survey, added, "We use a licensed firm. The bank wouldn't sign off otherwise." Ellie nodded. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked back along the fence toward home. Behind her, Sutter said something to Lauren. Nobody laughed this time, but the silence said enough. That night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table. Her father had gone to bed and wrote a letter. 2 pages on lined paper by hand. She listed the years the water had come up through the old channel pulled from her grandfather's notebooks. 1987, 1994, 2003. She described the direction the channel ran and why a straight drilling grid would miss it. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't angry. She wrote the way Henry had taught her to write in the notebooks, just the facts, just what she had seen in order with dates. She photocopied 3 pages from Henry's notebooks on the old machine in the hallway that still worked if you held the lid down with your elbow. 1987, bottom field flooded again, third time in 11 years. Old channel running. Cattle won't drink at the South Trough. 1994 and 2003, similar entries, same pattern, same channel. She put everything in an envelope, addressed it to Pacific Ridge Bank, Commercial Real Estate Division, Denver, Colorado, put a stamp on it, and left it on the counter. The next morning, on her way to catch the school bus, she put the envelope in the mailbox at the end of the drive and lifted the flag. She didn't tell her father. A week later, June was clearing the kitchen table and found the draft of Ellie's letter in the back of her notebook. She didn't say anything about it for 3 days. Then on a Thursday evening, while Ellie sat reading one of Henry's old notebooks, June said quietly from the rocking chair, "You sent a letter to the bank." It wasn't a question. Tom was standing at the sink. He turned around. "What letter?" Ellie explained. She watched her father's face change, not to anger exactly, but to the kind of tightness that comes when a tired man learns that the world has gotten more complicated. "Ellie, what were you thinking?" He didn't raise his voice. That made it worse. "That bank has lawyers. We have $400 in our account. If they take this as harassment, if they send a cease and desist, I can't afford a lawyer to answer it. You're putting this family at risk." "I told them the truth," Ellie said. "The truth doesn't protect you when the other side has more money than you." Silence. At the rocking chair, June kept sewing her back to both of them and said just loud enough to carry, "Henry would have sent it." Tom looked at his mother. June didn't look up. Tom walked out to the porch. Ellie followed him. She stood beside him in the dark, listening to the river and the frogs and the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. After a while, Tom said in a voice that had softened but not entirely, "I'm not angry at you, Ellie. I'm scared." It was the first time her father had ever admitted fear to her face. Ellie stood with that for a long moment. She understood something she hadn't understood before. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about consequences. And consequences fell hardest on people who could least afford them. 3 weeks later, the envelope came back, unopened, stamped in red ink, returned to sender, no solicitation. Ellie stood at the mailbox holding the envelope. She looked at it for a long time. The address she had written so carefully. The stamp. The red stamp over it, mechanical and final. She didn't cry, but something tightened in her chest. The feeling of speaking into a void and having the void send your voice back in a sealed package. She put the envelope in the kitchen drawer with her notebook. Then she tore off one corner, the corner with the Denver postmark, and tucked it into the last page of her notebook. She didn't know why she saved it, but she saved it. The drilling rig came on a Thursday. Nate Dawson set up on the high ground, first running 3 test pits along the upper slope where the timber thinned out. The samples came up dry and firm, exactly what you'd expect on a Montana hillside. Then he walked his rig downhill in stages, pulling core samples every 200 feet along the grid the bank's architects had specified. At each point, he drilled to 12 feet, the depth required by his contract, and at each point, he hit firm ground at 11. Brown silt, some clay, a few river stones. He photographed them, bagged them, logged them. The grid was straight, the channel was not. Ellie stood on her side of the fence and watched. She could see Dawson's drill points marching across the bottom in their orderly line, and she knew from 5 years of walking that curve with her grandfather and 5 more years of walking it alone that the buried channel wound through the bottomland in a lazy S shape, and that every single one of Dawson's grid points was falling on one shoulder, or the other of that S missing the channel itself by 20 feet, here 30 feet there. Close enough to feel confident, not close enough to find what was hiding. At one point, Dawson paused at the drill site closest to the fence. He looked up and saw Ellie standing there, 40 feet of grass and barbed wire between them. He looked at the soil sample in his hand. Then he looked to his left, the direction Ellie had pointed weeks before. He almost said something. His mouth opened slightly, then Sutter's voice from up the slope. "Dawson, how's the progress?" Dawson turned away. The moment passed. That night, Ellie wrote in her notebook, "Drill holes 7 and 8 are about 25 feet east of the channel. Nobody knows." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark looking at the ceiling, and for the first time the doubt came. Not a whisper, but a weight. Dawson had a degree. The firm had a license. The bank had protocols and checklists and engineers with decades of experience. She had a spiral notebook and the memory of walking through wet grass with an old man when she was 9 years old. What if the channel wasn't there? What if Henry had been wrong? What if the grass changed color for some other reason? Drainage, soil composition, something a real geologist would know, and she didn't. She got out of bed, went downstairs, opened the kitchen drawer, took out her notebook, flipped to the first page she had ever written, age 8, the handwriting barely legible. "Water up in bottom field. Cows won't drink south trough." Wrong spelling, right observation. She cross-checked it against Henry's entry for the same date, same year. Identical event recorded independently, 6 decades of the same land, telling the same story to anyone who would listen. She closed the notebook, put her hand on the cover. She wasn't 100% certain, but she was certain she had seen what she had seen and seen it many times over many years with her own eyes. That had to count for something, even if no one was counting. The next evening, she went to Henry's room. He was in his wheelchair by the window watching the last light drain out of the valley. She pulled a chair beside him and drew a map on a blank page of her notebook. The bottomland, small circles for Dawson's drill points, a curving red line for the buried channel drawn from memory, from walking it, from reading 53 notebooks, full of the same curve described in different seasons and different years. She held it up for him. His eyes moved across the page. His hand trembled. Then he raised one finger and pointed to a specific spot on the map, the place where the curve bent sharpest, the place where he had driven the wooden stake into the ground 5 years ago. He made a sound that was not a word but carried the weight of one. Ellie looked at the map at his finger at the spot, and she understood something. Henry hadn't lost his mind, he had lost his voice. The land was still alive inside him, as clear as a map, as precise as a surveyor's coordinates. He just couldn't say it anymore. She was his voice now. She taped the map to the wall of his room, next to the window where he sat every day. June appeared in the doorway, looked at the map, looked at her husband, and said nothing. But she reached out and touched the doorframe, the way you touch something to steady yourself. They broke ground in June. The graders came first, peeling the topsoil off the building footprint and pushing it into long berms along the eastern edge. Then the excavators digging the foundation pad 8 feet down for the slab and the loading dock pits. At 6 feet on the riverside, they hit water, not a flood, a seep, a slow darkening on the wall of the excavation like a bruise forming in the earth. Dawson came back out. He took readings. He told the foreman it was within tolerance. Groundwater in a river bottom was normal. They would install a drainage course and a vapor barrier and proceed. Sutter looked at the seep the way he looked at most problems, as something between him and his schedule. He had built on wetter ground in Louisiana. He called Denver. Within tolerance, he said, proceeding. Denver signed off on the variance that afternoon. They poured the footings on a Wednesday in late June. The slab went down the following Tuesday. Concrete trucks lined up on the access road like gray elephants, and the pour took all day. Ellie stood on the hill on her family's side of the fence and watched. She saw the dark stain of water at the base of the cut. She saw the concrete going in over it. She opened her notebook, wrote the date, and then she wrote, "They hit water, they didn't stop." She closed the notebook and looked down at the construction site for a long time. She felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Not fear, not anger, a sadness that comes from watching something inevitable happen and knowing you've done everything you could and it wasn't enough. On a Saturday in late June, Ellie walked out to check the wooden stake her grandfather had driven at the sharpest bend of the buried channel. The stake was on what used to be Whitaker land, now bank land, about 60 feet from the edge of the construction site. It was still standing, leaning a little more than last year, but holding. Around its base, she noticed something new. Fine cracks in the soil, hairline fractures radiating outward from the stake like the lines on a shattered windshield. The cracks hadn't been there in April. They were from the vibration, the heavy machinery on the construction site, the compactors and the excavators were sending tremors through the ground, and the ground was answering. She knelt and took a photograph with her father's old phone, the one with no data plan that she carried only for the camera. She taped the photo into her notebook beside the day's entry. When she stood up and turned to walk back, Ray Sutter was standing at the fence 40 feet away, arms crossed. "That's our land you're on," he said. "Bank property. You don't have the right to be over here." "I was checking a stake my grandfather put in," Ellie said. "There's no stake of your grandfather's on this property. This land belongs to Pacific Ridge Bank. Next time I see you on this side of the fence, I'm calling the sheriff." Ellie walked back to her side of the wire. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear of the sheriff, from anger. That stake had been in the ground before the bank knew Montana existed, before Sutter had ever set foot in this valley, before any of them. It was there because an old man who had spent his life listening to the land wanted to mark the place where the land was trying to tell him something. And now a man in a hard hat was telling her she had no right to stand next to it. That night, Tom found Ellie sitting at the kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her, but she wasn't writing. She was staring at the page. "What happened?" She told him about Sutter, about the threat, about the stake. Tom was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that happens when a man is calculating not what he wants to do, but what he can afford to do. He looked at the bills on the table. He looked at his daughter. "I'll talk to Walt Briggs," he said. Walt Briggs was the county commissioner, 72 years old. He had known Henry Calloway since they were both young men running cattle in this valley back when the roads were dirt and the nearest doctor was 2 hours away. Walt was a careful man, a political man, in the way that small-town officials have to be, political, balancing everyone's interests and offending no one. But he was also honest, and he remembered things, and he owed Henry Calloway more than one favor from the old days. It was the first time Tom had reached for help instead of telling Ellie to be quiet. She watched her father pick up the phone, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. He was still afraid, but he was choosing to stand beside her anyway. And Ellie understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else mattered more. The concrete slab laid on the river bottom like a gray lid pressed over a secret. Somewhere beneath it, in the permeable gravel of a channel that had been carrying water long before anyone built anything on this land, the buried river waited. It had nowhere to go, but it was patient. It had been patient for 1,000 years. It could be patient a little longer. And in the kitchen drawer of a farmhouse on the eastern bend of the Cottonwood River, a green spiral notebook held the only record that mattered, written in pencil in the careful hand of a 14-year-old girl who had learned to read the land the way her grandfather read it, one season at a time, one observation at a time, one truth at a time. The notebook would be needed soon. Ellie just didn't know how soon. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late August, 8 weeks after the pour. Nobody saw it happen. That's the thing about the ground. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a warning letter or schedule a meeting. It just moves a fraction of an inch at a time in the dark under the weight of everything people have put on top of it. And one morning there's a line in the concrete that wasn't there the night before. The crack ran across the northeast corner of the slab, thin as a pencil stroke, barely visible unless you got down on your knees and looked. The finishing crew logged it with intolerance. Concrete cracks. That's what concrete does. You note it, you watch it, you move on. By mid-October, the crack had widened to a quarter inch and spawned two more, all three running in the same direction and all three on the river side of the building. The steel framework was going up by then, and every beam and bolt and cross brace added load to the slab beneath. The cracks didn't care about the construction schedule. They had their own timetable. Nate Dawson drove out from Billings on a Friday afternoon and stood over the cracks for 20 minutes without speaking. He took measurements. He photographed them from 3 angles. Then he found Sutter in the site office, a construction trailer parked on the upper bench with a view of the whole operation. "I'd like to drill a few supplementary test holes," Dawson said, "off the original grid, along the south side of the slab where the cracking is concentrated." Sutter was sitting behind a folding desk covered in schedules and invoices. He didn't look up. "Contract doesn't include supplementary drilling." "I understand that. I'm recommending it." "Then write a proposal, send it to Denver, wait 6 weeks for approval." Sutter looked up now, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had done the math on his own future. "I don't have 6 weeks, Dawson. I've got a completion bonus tied to a December deadline. Every day we stop is money out of my pocket. You want to drill holes, you go through channels." Dawson looked at the man behind the desk. He thought about the dark stain of water he had seen at 6 feet back in June, the stain he had called with intolerance. Because it was with intolerance, because the numbers said so, because the contract said 12 feet, and he had drilled 12 feet, and the ground had been firm at 11. And that was supposed to be the end of the conversation. He went back to his truck. He sat in the cab for a while. Then he wrote an email to the project office in Denver. He described the cracking pattern, attached his photographs, and recommended supplementary drilling at 5 points along the south side of the foundation. He was careful with his language. He did not use the word urgent. He did not use the word danger. He used the word recommend, which in the vocabulary of engineering correspondence means something very specific. It means I'm telling you, and if you ignore me, I have a record that I told you. Denver replied the same day. One line, noted, proceed per approved plan. Dawson read the reply twice. Then he printed the email, folded it into quarters, and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. He didn't know why he kept it. Instinct, maybe. The instinct of a man who has been in the business long enough to know that when the ground is talking and nobody is listening, someone is eventually going to ask who knew and when they knew it. The engineers argued through October. One blamed the concrete mix, said the batch had been too wet, said the finishing crew had rushed the cure. Another blamed the curing schedule, said the tarps came off too early in the August heat. They brought data. They brought charts. They stood over the cracks and pointed at each other's reports and used words that turned disagreement into something technical and therefore manageable. Nobody mentioned the ground. Nobody except Claire Bennett. Claire was 28 years old. She had a master's degree from the Colorado School of Mines, where she had written her thesis on paleochannel identification in the Colorado River Basin. For 2 years after graduation, she had sat at a desk in the engineering firm's Denver office, reviewing other people's fieldwork, running other people's numbers, writing sections of reports that went out under other people's names. The Pacific Ridge Project was her first real field assignment. She had fought for it. Her supervisor had told her it was a straightforward job, a box to check the kind of project you send a junior engineer to because nothing was going to go wrong. She arrived at the site in mid-October and spent her first day not talking to anyone. She walked the perimeter of the building footprint, slowly stopping every few yards to crouch and look at the ground. She carried a geological hammer and a hand lens and a notebook of her own, smaller than Ellie's, with a black cover. She walked for 2 hours. When she was done, she went to the foreman's trailer and asked a single question. Did anyone drill deeper than 12 feet anywhere on this bottom or off the grid? The foreman, a steady man named Richardson, who had been building things in hard places for 30 years, looked at her for a moment and said no. Claire went to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and called the only person she trusted to tell her the truth. Her graduate advisor, a professor at Mines named Dr. Alderman, who had spent his career studying the hidden architecture of river systems. If you're seeing differential settlement oriented toward the river, Alderman said, and the drill logs show firm ground on a regular grid, the first thing I'd check is whether the grid missed a buried channel. Pull the historical aerials. Go back as far as you can. Look for crop marks, vegetation anomalies, anything that traces a curve. Claire hung up and opened her laptop. She spent the next 3 weeks working on her own time in her motel room in the evenings after the site shut down, accessing the USGS archive with her personal account and paying the download fees out of her own pocket. She pulled aerial photographs of the Cottonwood River Valley going back to 1954. Black and white images, grainy, taken from small planes by government surveyors, mapping a country that didn't know yet how much it was going to change. She pulled the original soil survey from the 1970s, the one the county had commissioned when they were planning the rural water system. She overlaid the images on her laptop screen, adjusting for scale and orientation, and she began to see it. A faint line in the 1954 photograph. A curve of slightly different vegetation running through the bottom end, visible from the air in a way it would never be visible from the ground, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for and exactly where to look. The line matched the soil survey's notation of alluvial deposits undetermined depth in the same area. And it curved. It curved in a long S shape through the footprint of the building that Pacific Ridge Bank had just spent $17 million constructing. She mapped the channel. She calculated its orientation. It ran diagonally beneath the site at roughly 40 degrees off the drilling grid. The grid had been laid out in a straight north-south pattern based on the architect's site plan. The channel ran northwest to southeast, crossing the grid at an angle that meant every single test pit had landed on the shoulder of the channel without penetrating its center. The center where the permeable alluvium ran deepest, where the ground was least stable, where a building's foundation would settle unevenly and crack in exactly the pattern she was seeing on the slab. She knew what she had found. She also knew what it would cost her to say it. She took her findings to Sutter on a Wednesday morning, standing in the site office with her laptop open and her voice steady. Sutter listened for about 90 seconds. Then he said, "You were hired to assess cracking, not to rewrite the geotechnical survey. If you want to change the scope of work, submit a proposal through Denver." Mr. Sutter, the foundation is sitting across the deepest part of a buried channel. The settlement is differential. The cracks are going to get worse. I heard you. Submit the proposal. Claire closed her laptop. She stood there for a moment looking at Sutter, and she understood something about the man. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't even necessarily wrong to follow procedure. He was a man whose entire career had been built on the principle that you follow the plan, you meet the deadline, you collect the bonus, and you move on to the next job. The plan was the plan. Changing the plan meant admitting the plan was wrong, and admitting the plan was wrong meant someone had to pay for it, and the person who raised the flag was usually the first one handed the bill. She could submit the proposal, go through channels, wait 6 to 8 weeks for Denver to review it, debate it, assign a committee, schedule a call. By then, the cladding would be finished, the loading docks would be poured, the building would be further along and further committed and harder to stop. Or she could pick up the phone and call the one person in the organization who had the authority to halt construction without a committee. She chose the phone. Grant Whitfield was in his office in Denver when the call came. He listened to Claire Bennett, a junior engineer he had never spoken to before, describe in precise, measured language what she believed was underneath his $17 million building. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds. "Has anyone ever raised this concern before?" he asked. "Before construction, did anyone mention a buried channel?" "Not that I'm aware of," Claire said. Grant put her on hold. He opened his email system. He searched the project file for the Cottonwood River site. He searched incoming correspondence, meeting notes, site reports. Nothing. Then he searched the spam filter, the automatic system that screened unsolicited mail sent to the commercial real estate division. The system caught hundreds of messages a week, most of them junk, most of them deleted without being read. In the spam folder dated April of that year, he found a scanned image of a returned envelope. The system had logged it before routing the physical letter back. 2 pages of lined paper, handwritten. 3 photocopied pages from what appeared to be a notebook dated 1987, 1994, and 2003. Neat handwriting, small and precise, describing flooding events in a bottom field along the Cottonwood River, an old channel running, cattle refusing to drink from a south trough. The letter was signed Ellie Calloway. The return address was a rural route number less than a mile from the construction site. Grant read the letter twice. He looked at the photocopied notebook pages. He looked at the date on the envelope. April. Before the survey, before the drilling, before the pour, before any of it. He picked up the phone and called Lauren Sheffield. "Set up a meeting at the county extension office. Invite the Calloway family and invite Walt Briggs." Meanwhile, in November, the cladding was going up and the consequences were flowing downhill. The Calloway Spring had run clean for as long as anyone could remember. It emerged at the toe of the slope on the Calloway side of the fence, fed by groundwater that moved through the subsurface from the higher ground to the north. The construction site sat directly uphill, up gradient on the other side of the fence. Whatever went into the ground up there came out down here. That was hydrology. That was gravity. That was a fact as old as the valley. Tom Calloway walked out to the spring on a November morning to check the stock trough. The cattle were standing in a loose group 30 yards from the trough, which was unusual. They should have been drinking. He walked to the trough and looked at the water. It looked normal. He cupped his hand and brought it to his lips. He spat it out immediately. There was a taste in the water that didn't belong there. Metallic, faint, like sucking on a penny. He tasted it again to be sure. Same thing. He looked at the cattle. They already knew. He called the county extension office. They sent a technician out the next day, a quiet woman in a state vehicle who took samples in glass bottles and labeled them with a marker and didn't offer any opinions. 2 weeks later, the lab report arrived in the mail. Elevated turbidity, trace petroleum compounds consistent with heavy equipment runoff, suspended sediment matching the profile of disturbed subsurface material, up gradient of the sampling point. Tom read the report at the kitchen table. He read it again. Then he went outside and stood on the porch for a long time looking at the construction site on the other side of the fence, where the lights were on and the machines were still running. When he came back inside, he sat down across from Ellie. He didn't speak right away. He put his hands flat on the table the way a man does when he is trying to hold something steady. Then he said, "I'm sorry, you were right back in April, and I told you to keep quiet." Ellie looked at her father. She saw something she had never seen in his face before. Not defeat. Something more painful than defeat. The recognition that he had failed, not in a practical way, not by miscalculating a feed order or missing a payment, but in a moral way. He had told his daughter to be silent when she was telling the truth, and the silence had cost them. "You were right too," Ellie said. "We didn't have a lawyer." "Now we have evidence," Tom said. The kind Walt was talking about. The kind that speaks in a language they have to listen to. He looked at her. "Get your notebook." Tom called Walt Briggs that night. Walt called the Department of Environmental Quality the next morning. The machinery of government began to turn slowly the way it always turns, but it was turning. While they waited, the town began to take sides. The Pacific Ridge Project had promised 40 permanent jobs and 100 construction jobs. In a town where the feed store, the post office, and the gas station were the entire economy, 40 permanent jobs was not an abstraction. It was mortgages being paid. It was kids staying instead of leaving. It was the difference between a town that was dying and a town that had a chance. The Callaways were threatening that. That was how the town saw it. Not as a family whose water had been poisoned, but as troublemakers who were putting their own interest ahead of everyone else's. Ellie felt it at school first. Mason Traeger caught her in the yard during lunch, not with fists, not with anything that would get him sent to the principal's office, but with words delivered at a volume calibrated for maximum audience. "My dad says your family is suing the bank for a payout. The project is good for this whole town, but you people only think about yourselves." Ellie didn't respond. She walked around him. She heard the laughter behind her, not the small, harmless kind she'd heard at the fence in April. This had teeth. That afternoon, walking home, she passed the main street of town. Feed store, post office, diner hardware. On the telephone pole outside the diner, someone had stapled a sheet of paper, block letters printed from a computer. "Pacific Ridge equals jobs. Don't let troublemakers ruin it." No name, no signature, just the accusation hanging in public where everyone could see it and no one had to own it. Ellie stopped and read it. She read it again. Then she kept walking. That night, she wrote in her notebook. Not about water, not about soil, the first entry she had ever written about people. November the 14th. Half the town thinks we're suing for money. I don't want money, I want clean water. But I don't know how to make them understand the difference. She left the notebooks on the table when she went to bed. She didn't realize June had read it until the next morning when her grandmother did something Ellie had not expected. June Calloway had barely left the house since Henry's stroke. She went to church on Sundays and to the pharmacy once a month, and that was all. She was a woman who had made her peace with a small radius. But that Thursday morning, she put on her good coat, combed her hair, got into the old farm truck with the rust along the wheel wells, and drove into town. She walked into Traeger's feed store. 3 men were standing at the counter talking. Old man Traeger was behind the register. They were talking about the Callaways. June heard her family's name as she came through the door. The conversation stopped. June didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She stood at the counter and waited until every man in that store was looking at her, and then she spoke. My family is not suing anyone. We have not spoken to a lawyer. The water from our spring is contaminated. Our cattle won't drink it. If anyone in this room wants to know the truth, drive out to our place and taste the water yourself. I don't need anyone to believe me. I need someone to taste. She bought 50 pounds of chicken feed, paid cash, drove home. Old man Traeger stood behind his register and said nothing. Mason, who had been in the back room doing homework, came to the doorway and watched June Calloway walk out to her truck. For the first time in this whole affair, he had nothing to say. 2 days later, one of the men from the feed store drove out to the Calloway place. His name was Dale Hendricks, and he ran cattle on the other side of town, and he had known Henry for 40 years. He cupped his hand in the spring water and tasted it. He spat it out. He stood there for a moment, then he looked at Tom and said, "That's not right." He told 3 other ranchers. They told others. The town didn't flip overnight, but the ground shifted. People who had been repeating the word troublemaker started using the word contamination instead. The 2 words pointed in very different directions. The meeting was held at the county extension office on a Thursday in early December. Tom drove Ellie in. She wore a blue flannel shirt and her good boots. The notebook was on her lap. Lauren Sheffield was there. Grant Whitfield was there, having flown in from Denver that morning. Nate Dawson was there sitting by the window with his hands in his lap. Claire Bennett was there with her laptop and a rolled-up map. A representative from the Department of Environmental Quality, Walt Briggs, a lawyer for Pacific Ridge Bank, who sat at the end of the table and took notes and said nothing. And in the corner of the room, uninvited but present, Ray Sutter sat with his arms folded across his chest. Nobody told him to leave. Claire Bennett spoke first. She connected her laptop to the projector and walked the room through her analysis. The aerial photographs from 1954, the soil survey from the 1970s, the vegetation anomaly she had traced across 60 years of images. She showed the channel on her map drawn in red curving through the building footprint in a long S oriented at 40 degrees off the drilling grid. She explained the geology once clearly without repeating herself. Permeable alluvium filling the channel to a depth of 44 feet. The 12-foot test pits landing on the shoulders missing the center. The foundations sitting across the deepest sections settling unevenly cracking. The construction runoff entering the channel at the excavation cut and traveling through the gravel downhill to the Calloway Spring. She put the map on the table. Ellie looked at it. The red curve on Claire Bennett's map ran exactly where her grandfather had walked her when she was 9 years old. Through the lower pasture past the place where the grass grew darker and taller around the bend, where the wooden stake stood in the ground. Every turn, every bend, every subtle shift in direction, identical, as if Claire had somehow found Henry's footprints in the data and traced them in red ink. Ellie looked at the map on the table and thought of the map she had drawn in pencil on a page of notebook paper and taped to the wall of her grandfather's room. The same curve, the same shape, one drawn from satellite imagery and soil surveys in a master's degree, the other drawn from memory and 53 notebooks and a walk through wet grass at dawn. The room was silent. Grant Whitfield cleared his throat. "I'd like to ask whether anyone at any point mentioned the existence of this channel before construction began." Dawson looked at his hands. Lauren Sheffield looked at Ellie. The lawyer at the end of the table stopped writing. Tom spoke quietly. "My daughter told you in April." Then Tom reached into his jacket pocket and took out the envelope. The one with the red stamp. Returned to sender, no solicitation. He set it on the table next to Claire's map. "And she wrote to you. The letter was returned unopened." Grant Whitfield looked at the envelope. He recognized the Denver postmark. He had seen the scanned version in the spam folder. But seeing it here, the physical object on the table next to a scientific map that had cost his bank tens of thousands of dollars to produce an envelope dressed in the careful handwriting of a 14-year-old girl that was different. Walt Briggs, who had been silent since the meeting began, spoke for the first time. Henry Calloway told me about this channel in 1994 when the county was planning to put a pump station on this bottom. The county listened to him. He paused. You folks didn't. One sentence. No accusation in it, just a fact stated by a 72-year-old man whose word carried weight in this room because he had spent 50 years earning it. In the corner, Ray Sutter uncrossed his arms. He put his hands on his knees. He stood up. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He spoke to the door frame or to the air or to no one in particular. I heard the girl at the fence, I remember. Then he walked out. It was not an apology. It was not an admission of wrongdoing in any language a lawyer would recognize. But in that room among those people, it was an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any formal statement of regret. The man who had dismissed her, who had threatened her, who had blocked the supplementary drilling and pushed the schedule and called Denver to say with intolerance, that man had just stood up in front of everyone and said two words that changed the shape of the silence. I remember. The meeting continued for another hour. The DEQ representative issued a formal notice. Pacific Ridge Bank was required to halt construction immediately and commission a full hydrogeological study. The cost estimate when the firm in Billings ran the numbers came in at just over $4 million on top of the $17 million already spent. The slab would have to be removed. The building would have to be redesigned, relocated, or both. The Callaway Spring would be remediated at the bank's expense, and the family would receive compensation for loss of use. Numbers. Large numbers. The kind of numbers that make people in boardrooms sit very still and breathe through their noses. But for Ellie, the numbers weren't the point. After the meeting broke up, after the handshakes and the quiet conversations in the hallway, and the sound of car doors closing in the parking lot, Nate Dawson was still standing by his truck. Ellie walked past on her way to Tom's pickup. Ellie, she stopped. Dawson reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He had been carrying it since August. The email he had sent to Denver recommending supplementary drilling. The one-line reply, noted, proceed per approved plan. He held it out to her. I saw it too, he said. The water at 6 feet, the cracking pattern. I saw it and I recommended action and they told me to proceed. I have 20 years in this business and a license on my wall, and I was not brave enough to say it louder. Ellie took the paper. She looked at Dawson. She didn't see a negligent engineer. She saw a man who had been caught between what he knew and what the system allowed him to say, and who had chosen the system and who was now standing in a parking lot in December holding out the evidence of his own compromise to a girl who was half his age and twice his courage. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She nodded once. Then she walked to her father's truck and got in and closed the door. Tom started the engine. They pulled out of the parking lot. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Tom said, "You did good in there." Ellie looked out the window at the valley going past the fields and the fences and the river running silver in the winter light. I didn't say anything in there. You didn't have to, Tom said. The notebook said it. The letter said it. The envelope said it. Sometimes you don't have to talk, Ellie. You just have to have been right long enough for the world to catch up. They drove home in the fading light. In Ellie's pocket, a folded email. In the kitchen drawer, a green notebook and a torn corner of an envelope. A small collection growing by one piece at a time, assembled not by a lawyer or an engineer or a vice president, but by a girl who understood something that none of them had been taught, that the land keeps its records, and that sometimes the most important record is the one kept by the person nobody thought to ask. The lawyer's name was Pembroke, and he arrived at the Callaway farm on a Wednesday afternoon in a rented sedan that he parked at an angle in the drive as if he expected to leave quickly. He wore a gray suit and carried a leather briefcase, and he did not look at the barn or the fields or the river. He looked at the porch steps and calculated whether they would hold his weight, and then he came inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the briefcase and took out a single document, 12 pages clipped together with a binder clip. Tom offered coffee. Pembroke declined. Ellie sat across the table with her hands in her lap. June was in the doorway to the hall, leaning against the frame the way she did when she intended to listen to every word without being addressed. Pacific Ridge Bank is prepared to offer your family a settlement of $35,000, Pembroke said. He laid the document on the table and turned it so the print faced Tom. This covers remediation costs for the spring loss of use compensation and a goodwill payment for the disruption to your operations. Tom looked at the number, $35,000. It was almost exactly the amount he owed on the farm loan. The past due balance, the penalties, the accumulated interest that had been growing like a vine around his ankles for the past year and a half. $35,000 would clear it all. The farm would be free. He could fix the tractor. He could breathe. There's a non-disclosure provision on page 8, Pembroke said in the same tone a man uses to mention that a car comes with floor mats. Standard language, it simply means the terms of the settlement and the circumstances surrounding it remain confidential. No public statements, no media engagement, no social media commentary. Standard. Tom turned to page 8. He read it slowly. Ellie watched his eyes move across the lines, watched his jaw tighten, watched his thumb press into the edge of the page, hard enough to leave a crescent mark in the paper. If I sign this, Tom said, we can't talk about what happened. You would be compensated for your discretion, Pembroke said. That's not what I asked. Pembroke adjusted his glasses. Correct. The agreement includes a mutual non-disclosure clause. Both parties agree not to discuss the specifics of the incident or the settlement publicly. Tom put the document down. He looked at Ellie. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke, but the conversation happened anyway in the space between a father and a daughter who had learned to read each other's silences the way they read the land. $35,000 meant the farm survived. Silence meant the notebooks, the letter, the photographs, the 53 years of Henry Callaway's observations. All of it would become a secret, not a record, not a warning for the next person who built on that bottom. A secret sealed in a drawer with a legal padlock on it. Pembroke waited. He was good at waiting. He had done this many times. I need to think about it, Tom said. Of course. Pembroke stood, buttoned his jacket, and left a business card on the table next to the document. The offer is open for 10 business days. He walked out. The screen door clapped shut behind him. They heard the rental car start and the tires crunch out on the gravel, and then silence. June spoke from the doorway. How much? $35,000. And the price? Tom looked at his mother. She knew. She always knew the real question before anyone asked it. We can't talk about it, any of it, ever. June was quiet for a moment, then she said, Henry kept those notebooks for 53 years. He didn't keep them so someone could lock them in a drawer. She turned and walked down the hall to Henry's room and closed the door. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She went downstairs and found Tom sitting at the table in the dark, the settlement document in front of him, Pembroke's card beside it. He wasn't reading, he was sitting. Dad, he looked up. I don't want to sign that, she said. Tom rubbed his face with both hands. He was so tired she could hear it in his breathing. Ellie, $35,000 saves this farm. I know. If we don't take it, we're back to $400 in the account and a loan officer who's running out of patience. I know that too. Then what do you want me to do? Ellie sat down across from him. She thought about her answer for a long time. Then she said, I want the notebooks to mean something. I want them to be a record, not a secret. If we sign that paper, everything Grandpa wrote becomes something nobody can read. That's not what he kept them for. Tom stared at the table. The house was silent around them. The furnace clicked on and hummed. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and received no answer. Okay, Tom said, okay. The next morning, Tom called Pembroke's office in Denver. He told the secretary that the Calloway family would accept compensation for the spring remediation, but would not accept the non-disclosure clause. He said it plainly, without anger, without negotiation. He said, we'll take the payment for the damage, we won't take the gag order. The counteroffer came back 3 days later. $22,000, no non-disclosure. Take it or leave it. $13,000 less than the original offer. Not enough to clear the farm loan entirely, but enough to bring it current and buy 6 months of breathing room. Tom signed it. $22,000 and his family's right to speak. That was the trade. It wasn't enough to fix everything. But it was enough to keep going, and keeping going was what Callaways had been doing on this land for over 100 years. The second meeting was held in January at the same extension office with the same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the same institutional clock on the wall. But the room felt different this time. The adversarial charge had drained out of it. What remained was something more practical, more honest, and in its own way, more difficult. Not a confrontation, but a collaboration. Richard Vance had flown in from the bank's regional headquarters in Denver. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of face that suggested he had spent most of his career listening to other people argue and then making the decision they couldn't make for themselves. He walked into the extension office, saw Ellie sitting in a folding chair with the green notebook on her lap, and crossed the room to her. I'm Richard Vance, he said. He held out his hand, not to Tom, to Ellie. I've been reading about your family's observation. I wanted to meet you. Ellie shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who meant it. Vance had brought a roll of new plans. He spread them on the table, weighing the corners with coffee mugs and a stapler. The building had been redesigned, relocated 300 yards east and uphill on the upper bench where the ground was firm and the drainage ran naturally to the north. The bottom land, the 5,000 acres of river bottom where the channel ran, was empty on the new plains. White space, unmarked. But Vance hadn't come to show Ellie the new building. He had come to ask her about everything else. The frost pockets that formed in the swale behind the upper ridge in late November. The drainage pattern on the east-facing slope that shifted direction after heavy rain. The places where Henry had noted groundwater seeping upward in wet years. The areas where cattle consistently refused to graze for reasons no soil test had ever explained. Would you walk me through what you know about this land? Vance said. Not the channel. We have the channel now. The other things. The things your grandfather recorded. Ellie looked at Tom. Tom nodded once. She opened the notebook. She spoke for 1 hour and 10 minutes. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in the short, calm sentences Henry had taught her, each one carrying a single observation, a single fact delivered, and then released. When Vance asked her to clarify, she clarified. When Claire Bennett, sitting at the end of the table with her own notebook open, asked technical questions about seasonal water table fluctuations. Ellie answered them with the precision of someone who had been measuring the same patch of ground for 6 years and reading her grandfather's measurements for the 53 years before that. At one point, she turned to the new plans and put her finger on a spot near the eastern property line where the architects had drawn a retention pond. "This won't hold water in August," she said. "The ground looks solid, but there's a gravel layer about 9 feet down." Grandpa marked it in his 1998 notebook. Every time they had a dry summer, the water in this area drained faster than anywhere else on the property. "If you put a pond here, you'll lose it by midsummer." Vance looked at Claire. Claire made a note. Neither of them argued. Neither of them smiled politely and moved on. They wrote it down. Midway through, Vance interrupted gently. "Ellie, where did you learn all of this?" She stopped. She considered the question with the same seriousness she considered everything. "Nobody taught me," she said. "My grandfather showed me how to look. Then I looked." The room was quiet after that. Claire wrote something in her notebook that Ellie wouldn't see until months later. A single-line observational field knowledge, 53-year continuous record, cannot be replicated by a single survey. When the meeting ended, people stood and gathered their papers and spoke in low voices. Vance rolled up his plans. Claire closed her laptop. The DEQ representative shook Tom's hand and said something about follow-up inspections. Grant Whitfield stayed behind. He waited until the room was empty except for the two of them. He stood near the table, his hands at his sides, and looked at the green spiral notebook in Ellie's hands. He looked at it the way you look at something you should have paid attention to a long time ago. "How long have you been keeping that?" he asked. "Since I was 8. Before that, my grandfather. He started in 1971. Grant nodded slowly. He looked different from the man she had met at the fence in April. Not older exactly, but changed in a way that showed in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his mouth. He carried a new weight, and the weight was knowledge. Not the kind that comes from data or reports, but the kind that comes from realizing that you made a decision without asking the right question, and that the question had been standing on the other side of a barbed wire fence the whole time wearing boots and holding a notebook. "We should have asked you," he said, "in the spring when you came to the fence." Ellie looked at him. She had imagined this moment in some vague way, the moment when someone from the bank admitted she had been right. She had expected to feel satisfaction. Vindication, maybe. She didn't feel either. She felt the same quiet heaviness she saw in Grant's face. Regret is not a single person's burden. It radiates outward and touches everyone nearby. She thought of her father, who had also told her to be quiet, who had also been wrong, and who had also found the words to say so. Adults are wrong in different ways, but they are alike in how difficult it is for them to say it out loud. She held out her hand. Grant took it. They shook, and then he turned and walked out, and Ellie stood alone in the extension office, listening to the clock tick on the wall. Spring came the way it always comes to Montana, slowly, and with reservations, the snow retreating up the mountains in stages, the river rising by inches, the grass turning from brown to green in patches that spread outward day by day until the whole valley was awake. The new plans were finalized in March. The processing facility would be built on the upper bench 300 yards east of the original site on ground that Ellie had confirmed was solid. The bottomland was left alone. Pacific Ridge Bank signed a conservation easement on the river bottom, a legal document that prohibited development on the floodplain in perpetuity. Partly it was a gesture of goodwill, a public relations move by a bank that had spent $21 million learning a lesson it could have learned for the price of a stamp. Partly it was because the engineers, having finally understood what lay beneath, had concluded that building there was not a matter of expense, but of impossibility. The buried channel ran where it had always run. The water moved through it the way it had moved for centuries, invisible and patient, following the path that the river had carved and the land had remembered. The killdeer came back in April and nested in their old places along the bank 20 yards closer to the water than the previous year. The cattails in the south slough thickened. The wet patch at the base of the lower pasture was wet again in May, right on schedule. The wooden stake still stood in the ground at the sharpest bend of the channel, now inside the conservation easement. Nobody would pull it up. Nobody would build over it. It leaned a little further south than it had the year before, but it held. One afternoon in late April, Ellie walked out to the stake. It was a Saturday warm, the kind of spring day that makes you forget that winter ever happened. She stood next to the stake and put her hand on its top, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone you haven't seen in a while. The wood was gray and weathered and smooth. Around its base, the hairline cracks from the construction vibrations had healed, filled in by frost and rain, and the slow rearrangement of soil particles that happens when the ground is left to its own devices. She stood there for a few minutes, not writing anything, not observing anything, just standing. Sometimes the land doesn't need to be read. Sometimes it just needs someone to be there. At school, the following week, Ellie was walking across the parking lot when Mason Traeger fell into step beside her. He didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead, walking with his hands in his pockets, as if he happened to be going in the same direction at the same speed entirely by coincidence. "Your spring," he said. "Is it clean yet?" Ellie was surprised enough that she stopped walking. Mason stopped too still, not looking at her, studying the cracked asphalt with great concentration. "Almost," she said. "They're still running tests." Mason nodded. Then he walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he had said in the yard of the word troublemaker of any of it. Just a question about water asked quietly with no audience by a 15-year-old boy who was not yet able to say he was sorry, but was able to ask the question that mattered. Ellie watched him go. She understood something about Mason in that moment that she hadn't understood before. That cruelty is sometimes just fear wearing a louder voice, and that the distance between unkindness and decency is sometimes exactly one honest question. Ellie turned 15 in May. The birthday was quiet the way all Callaway occasions were quiet. June made a chocolate cake from the recipe she had been using since Tom was a boy. Tom gave Ellie a new notebook. Same brand, same green cover, same spiral binding. He had driven to Billings to find it because the store in town didn't carry them. In June, she came home from school on a Thursday and found a thick envelope on the kitchen table. The return address was the engineering firm in Denver. Inside was a copy of the revised site plan, professionally bound with a clear cover, the kind of document that gets filed in official records and referenced in planning meetings for decades. Paper clipped to the cover was a handwritten note on a small piece of cream-colored stationery. "Ellie, we named the watershed feature after your grandfather, Callaway Paleo Channel. It will be in the county records from now on. I thought you should have a copy. Claire Bennett." Beneath Claire's note, there was a second piece of paper. Bank letterhead. The handwriting was different, slanted, and deliberate. The penmanship of someone who learned to write before keyboards existed. "Ellie, I keep a copy of your letter in my desk drawer, the one from April. I keep it to remind myself that sometimes the answer arrives before the question, if you're willing to listen. G.W." Ellie read both notes twice. She sat at the kitchen table holding them and feeling something she did not have a word for. It was not pride exactly. It was not relief. It was the feeling of a circle closing of a line that started somewhere in the past, finally meeting its other end. She stood up and walked down the hallway to Henry's room. He was in his wheelchair by the window as he always was, looking out at the valley. The pencil map she had drawn last spring was still taped to the wall beside him, the paper curling slightly at the edges, the red line of the channel fading where the sunlight hit it every afternoon. She pulled a chair beside him and sat down. She opened the bound site plan and held it where he could see it. Then she read Claire's note aloud. Callaway Paleo Channel Grandpa. That's your name. It's in the county records now. Henry looked at her. His eyes were clear. The fog that sometimes clouded them in the afternoons had not come today. He looked at her face, not at the document, not at the note at her face. Then he raised his hand trembling and pointed. Not at the map on the wall, not at the plans in her lap. At her, he put his finger out and pointed at Ellie, and then he brought his hand back and placed it flat on his own chest. Over his heart, he held it there. June stood in the doorway. She had been standing there long enough to hear everything. Her eyes were dry, but her voice was not when she said, "He's saying it belongs to you, not to him." Ellie took her grandfather's hand. It was thin and cool and the skin was papery, and she held it in both of hers and she did not speak. There are moments when silence is the most precise language available, when any word you could choose would be smaller than the thing you need to say, and this was one of them. She sat with him until the light changed and the room turned gold, and then amber, and then the soft gray that comes before evening. June brought in 2 cups of tea and left without a word. Tom came in from the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment and then went back to the kitchen. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when something important has happened, and everyone knows it and no one needs to discuss it. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table and opened her green notebook to the next blank page. She wrote an entry that was different from every entry she had written before. Not about water levels, not about killdeer or cattails, or the behavior of cattle around a certain trough. For the first time, she wrote about a person. June the 12th, Henry Callaway, the first person who taught me that the land can speak if anyone is willing to listen. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the kitchen drawer beside the other things that had accumulated there over the past year. The torn corner of the Denver postmark, Nate Dawson's folded email, Grant Whitfield's handwritten note, the settlement document with Tom's signature on the last page, the version without the gag order, the version that cost them $13,000 but bought them the right to remember out loud. A small archive, assembled not in a filing cabinet or a database, but in a kitchen drawer by a girl who understood that records come in many forms, and the most important ones are the ones that someone cared enough to keep. Tom came in from the porch. He had been standing outside. He read the notes from Claire and Grant over Ellie's shoulder. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to add that hadn't already been said. After a while, he walked back out to the porch and stood in the last light looking west toward the river and the valley and the ridge of mountains beyond. Ellie joined him. She stood where she always stood to his left, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The valley was settling into evening. Mist was forming in the low places rising from the ground in slow tendrils following the contours of the land. The river caught the last of the light and held it a silver thread winding through the green. Dad, yeah, do you think Grandpa knows about the name? Tom was quiet for a while. I think he knows, he said. I think he's known for a long time what that land was. He just needed someone to say it in a language that other people could hear. They stood on the porch together as the light faded and the stars came on one at a time, and the frogs started up along the river. The sound of the water was constant and unhurried, the sound of something that has been moving for a very long time and does not intend to stop. Somewhere in Denver, in a corner office on the 14th floor of the Pacific Ridge Bank building, there was a framed map hanging on the wall behind a vice president's desk. The map showed a section of the Cottonwood River Valley in central Montana, with the building footprint redrawn on the upper bench, and the bottom land marked as a conservation easement in green. In the lower right corner of the map, in small handwritten letters, someone had written a name, Ellie Calloway, and next to it, in even smaller letters, a date in April, the date she had come to the fence. Everyone who walked into that office saw the map. Most of them glanced at it and moved on. A few of them stopped and read the name and the date, and some of those few asked Grant Whitfield what it meant, and he told them. He told them about a girl and a notebook and a letter that came back unopened and a buried river that knew where it was going long before anyone thought to ask. And in a farmhouse kitchen in Montana, in a drawer that stuck a little when you pulled it, a green spiral notebook waited for tomorrow's entry. The notebook was almost full. There were only a few blank pages left, and after that, Ellie would start a new one. The same brand, the same green cover, and she would write the date in the water level and the direction of the wind and where the deer were drinking and which gates the cattle pushed through and which ones they avoided. She would write it down the way her grandfather had written it down for 53 years, the way her father had begun to understand, the way Claire Bennett had recognized from the air what Henry Calloway had known from the ground. Some knowledge doesn't come from reports. It comes from standing in the same place long enough to notice what changes and what doesn't. It comes from writing things down, not because anyone will read them, but because the act of recording is itself a form of respect, a way of saying to the land and the water and the animals and the seasons, I see you. I'm paying attention. You matter. And sometimes if you are patient enough and honest enough and stubborn enough to keep writing in a green spiral notebook year after year, the world catches up. Not because you forced it, not because you shouted, but because the truth like water finds its way through. The next morning before dawn, Ellie woke up. She got dressed quietly and walked downstairs and out through the kitchen to the porch. The sky was the color it gets before the sun decides to rise. The mist was moving in the low places, slow and deliberate, following the shape of the land. The air was cold and smelled like river water and wet grass and the particular sweetness of cottonwood leaves in early summer. She stood on the porch in the blue hour, in the exact spot where Henry used to stand, at the exact time he used to stand there, and she looked out at the valley. She didn't bring her notebook. She didn't need to write anything down. She just stood and watched and listened to the land tell its truth in the quiet way it always had to anyone willing to stand still long enough to hear it. She was 15 years old. She had time. Inside the house in the kitchen drawer, the notebook waited. It had a few blank pages left, and then there would be a new one, and after that, another and another stacking up in a wooden crate in the barn loft next to the 53 that came before. A record of the valley kept by the people who belonged to it, unbroken, ongoing, as patient and as permanent as the river itself.